Welcome back. We're going to pick up now with books 19, 20, and 21. We left our story with Telemachus dismissing the suitors and telling them to go home. So what happens now is that Odysseus and Telemachus are alone. We have to imagine that the servants have gone back to their quarters and they're all resting. So they're alone downstairs, and they're in the banquet hall. Now you have to step back for a moment and remember what banquet halls would have looked like in those days. They were decorated with trophies of war. So there would be spears, lances, swords, battle axes, shields, helmets, all kinds of stuff on the walls. And this is going to be dangerous to them because they know that they're going into battle and they don't want anything around that the suitors could take advantage of. So what they do is they take all this stuff off the wall and they move it up to a storage room. This is going to become important to us in the story, what goes on in that storage room. Meanwhile, I had to laugh because Athena now pulls off yet another disguise. She turns into a torch to light the way for them. And when we get to Exodus, you're going to see a similar image in a completely different text, in the Hebrew text. It's kind of interesting, two separate cultures using the same image. At any rate, one of the servant women sees Odysseus and lays into him. Now she still thinks he's a beggar, and says, you're hanging around, the party's over, what are you doing here? Penelope overhears this, and she threatens the woman and says, don't you go treating my guests that way. But more importantly, there's a little hint in there, and she says, I'm aware of your other ugly work, and you're going to pay for it with your life. So what that tells us is that Penelope's not stupid. She knows that among her servants, there are people who are not faithful to her. And she's letting it be known that they're not going to get away with this for much longer. Meanwhile, she has Odysseus pull up a chair. Remember, she had asked to meet with him. And she asks him who he is. So he makes up a name. He says his name is Aetheon of Crete. Remember, he had said earlier that he was from Crete. And he claims to have met Odysseus and traded a gift of friendship. So he's trying to pretend that he was once someone important. And it's the tragedy of war. And, I'm a beggar now, but I was once a great guy. And she says, oh yeah, what was Odysseus wearing? Of course, he is Odysseus, so he describes one of the outfits that she made for him, and typically, according to Homer, she bursts into tears because that's what Penelope does, right? In the text, I thought it was kind of cute, and this is, kudos to the translator. She calls Troy, where the war was, destroy. I thought that was rather clever. Anyway, Odysseus tells her that Odysseus is coming home soon, and she just flat out doesn't believe him. So she's pretty much convinced that he's either dead or he's stranded somewhere. And I'm not convinced that she really believed Telemachus when Telemachus said he's alive but he's on Calypso's island. Penelope makes an interesting comment to Odysseus, thinking that he's a beggar. She says to him that she's going to provide for him, she's going to give him clothes and a bath and all this stuff. And she says that if a man is cruel by nature, the mortal world will mock him when he's dead. And this goes back again to the idea of the House of the Dead doesn't really distinguish good from bad people, unless you're really, really bad and then you get one of those torments. So the only form of immortality that they have, since they don't really have a heaven, is the memory, the way that people remember you. So what she's telling us is that she wants to be remembered as a person who's very kind. And she's saying, these people who are nasty, they're going to get theirs. Not hell, but you're going to be remembered badly. That people are going to say bad things about you when you're dead. You'll be legendary in the wrong sense. So now she orders a bath for him, and who should come to give him his bath? But of course, his old nurse. And first she says, you remind me of old King Odysseus. I used to take care of him when he was a little boy, and you remind me of him. Then when she's bathing him, she sees this scar on his leg. And she realizes, because she remembers how he got that scar, she knows who it is. That's like having a birthmark. She recognizes it. So she starts to say something, and Odysseus shushes her up. But he's very cruel. He tells her that he's going to kill her. If she reveals this to anyone, she will pay for it with her life. So is that really necessary? I mean, this is the old woman who raised him. And could he not have said, shh, it's dangerous. Keep my secret for now. Surely he knows he could trust her, but instead he takes the cruel approach, and I really don't like that about it. In the backstory about how he got the scar, there's some really interesting points. Remember earlier I told you that in some versions of the Greek myths that Hermes is actually Odysseus' grandfather. In this version, in Homer's version, it turns out that Odysseus' maternal grandfather was really good pals with Hermes. In fact, the text calls Hermes his ready partner in Hermes, the ready partner in his crimes. That's lines 446 to 452. We're still in book 19. So apparently his maternal grandfather was a thief, and Hermes helped him, but the reason Hermes really liked him was that he would take a very large portion of whatever it was he stole and offered it to Hermes as a sacrifice. So it was kind of like this little partnership between them, so Hermes would help him to succeed at stealing more. So there's kind of sleazy past. Maybe that explains some of the morality issues that we see with Odysseus. Also, an interesting little side note is when he's bleeding, his uncles, instead of praying to the gods and sacrificing as we would expect them to, they utter incantations. And I'm not really sure if that means that they're involved in sorcery, that they have god blood themselves, so they have some kind of powers. But it does show us something a little bit hinky about his bloodline on that side. Now what I want to do is read aloud to you a section that's very, very important. This is again in book 19, where it lines 592 to 603. Penelope says, and she's speaking to Odysseus, but she doesn't know she is, "Do I stay beside my son and keep all things secure, my lands, my serving women, the high-roofed house, true to my husband's bed and the people's voice as well? Or do I follow at last the best man who courts me here in the halls, who gives me the greatest gifts? My son, when he was a boy and light-hearted, urged me not to marry and to leave my husband's house. But now he has grown and reached his young prime. He begs me to leave our palace, travel home. Telemachus, so obsessed with his own estate, the wealth my princely suitors bleed away." So what she's saying here, she misunderstands Telemachus' intent. What she's saying is that she thinks he wants her to, when she says travel home, remember that earlier he said, if I am gone for a year and I don't find my father, when I come back I will tell my mother to go to her father's house. Now he had said at that time to have her father choose her next husband. How she interprets it is that he wants her out of the house so that he can then become king and move up. She misunderstands her son's intent. He has no such intent. But she overheard him telling the suitors that, and she thinks that he's not exactly greedy, but he's very concerned that they're bleeding his wealth, and he wants to take the crown before he doesn't have an estate left. So if we'd been in the classroom, I would have written this on the board. Instead, I had to write it on a piece of paper for you. I want to show you the dilemma that Penelope is really struggling with at this point. And remember, she doesn't know that Odysseus is alive. So it really comes down to marry or not to marry. So we'll look first at the issue of marrying. Arguments in favor of that is that she did make this promise to Odysseus, that when Telemachus came of age, when he had a beard, that she would marry and leave the estate. So on one hand, honor is very important. She gave her word. She really should do that. And she also thinks that her son wants to inherit. So this is the honorable thing to do, to marry. On the other hand, this is what Penelope really wants to do. She wants to not marry. It's what her heart wants. She's not interested in these suitors, and frankly, I think they're a bunch of scumbags. I wouldn't want to marry them either. So that's what her heart wants. And in her own way, she feels that by not remarrying, she's being faithful to Odysseus, whether he's alive or dead. Honoring him and being his widow or being his wife is keeping her attachment to him, and she sees that as fidelity. She also mentions what the people want. The townspeople were very fond of Odysseus. The suitors come from the noble class. Remember, she calls them her princely suitors. And they want her to marry because, of course, they want to become king. But the townspeople were very fond of Odysseus, and if Penelope married, somebody else would be king, and it wouldn't be Telemachus. So she's aware that the people wanted her to be true to Odysseus's memory, and so that's the side where her heart is not marrying. But she has a real dilemma because she did give her word, and she's got to stand by it. Penelope now tells about a dream that she had, and she's not able to interpret it, so she asks Odysseus, but she never does get an answer from him. So I'll interpret it for you. She dreams about some pet geese that she has, and that an eagle comes in and swoops down and eats them all up, breaks their necks. In the dream, the eagle tells her that the geese are her suitors, and I am your husband back at last, to launch a terrible fate against them all. So her dream is actually a premonition. She doesn't realize it. But her dream is telling her that Odysseus has come home and he's going to throw the suitors out of her house. Let's hope it goes as well as it did in the dream. Now Penelope says, okay, I've decided how I'm going to choose the suitor. It's not going to be the guy who gives me the best gifts. I'm going to have a contest. And in my contest, I'm going to line up some axe handles. I'm going to create a channel, and they're going to have to shoot an arrow through this very narrow channel. So you're going to have to be very, the term they use is true, meaning that the arrow goes very, very straight, true to its mark. And whoever shoots it the farthest and the straightest will be my husband. Odysseus thinks this is so clever, and he encourages her to go ahead with it. So she goes back upstairs and she goes to bed. So now we move to book 20. Odysseus, as we've seen before, goes out on the porch to sleep. That's what they do. They don't have spare guest bedrooms, I guess. And what's significant about that strategic location is that he sees the servant girls, or at least some of them, going out to sleep with some of the suitors. So talk about sleeping with the enemy. And the suitors clearly are the enemy, and some of the servant girls are siding with them. So now he knows you can't be sure about who you trust. He pretty much spends the night worrying because now he's realized that he's really outnumbered. So there's just him and Telemachus. The text doesn't tell us how many suitors there are, but in my head I sort of imagine that it might be like 40 or 50 of them. Because if there were only, say, 20, I think Odysseus, being the egotistical maniac that he is, probably would think he could take on 10. And Telemachus could take on 10, and between us we'll wipe out 20. But so it's got to be a higher number. And he's actually worried about it. But Zeus sends him a sign, and he feels comforted. In the morning, along comes the swineherder. So it's just barely dawn. And what he's coming to do is to deliver the pigs, because remember, the suitors every day are feasting off of the family's belongings. So he brings pigs for them to slaughter. Not that he wants to, but he's been directed to. They slaughter and they feast off of his pigs. So Odysseus at this point reveals who he is and says, I might be needing your help. And along comes the cowherder, whose name is Philotius. And I just want to point out another one of those Homer devices. The letters Phil denote lover of, like a bibliophile is a person who loves books. A francophile is a person who loves French. An oneophile is a wine lover. So by putting phile at the beginning of Philotius's name, what Homer is telling us is that he's a good guy. So now we have Team Odysseus, as I like to call it. We have Odysseus, we have Telemachus, we have Eumaeus, the swineherder, and Philotius, the cowherder. So that's our ragtag team of 4. Maybe 4 against 40, maybe. Not looking like really good odds. At least I wouldn't like those odds a whole heck of a lot. Interestingly, this is another Homerian device. It's Apollo's feast day, and it would be a day of public feasting. You probably know Apollo as a sun god. He was the one who had the chariots and rode the sun across the sky. But he's also the god of archery, and that's going to become important because we have an archery contest coming up. Again, Athena riles up the suitors. They get Odysseus mad, and so he's getting his adrenaline going here. He's getting ready for the battle. At this point, Telemachus comes along, and so the feasting has started, I guess, um, and he's showing us a much more mature side of himself. So instead of before he used to hide and complain about the suitors, now he comes and he's just sitting right with them, and he takes a golden cup and gives it to his father, still disguised as a beggar, and says, "Anybody touch the old man, I'll kill you myself." So now we're seeing Telemachus in his maturing process, showing a lot more confidence and also showing some confidence in his physical skills, which is what we've not seen up until this point. One of these guys, and it doesn't say which one, throws an ox hoof at Odysseus, and Telemachus says, "You're lucky that you missed, because if you'd hit him, I would have killed you." The seer, remember I mentioned him before, the prophet Theoclymenus, now says that he's had a vision, and in his vision, blood is dripping in the hallways and ghosts are thronging the courtyard on their way to the world of death. So he's foretelling that something really ugly is going to happen. He's really smart. He leaves before it gets ugly. So now we move on to book 21, the last one that we're going to cover today. Athena now inspires Penelope, I guess it's morning and the girls are up too, that it's time to launch the archery contest. Penelope goes to a vault and she pulls out Odysseus's prized bow. So let me give you a little background about the technicalities here, because it'll make more sense to you. His bow, first of all, has been sitting there for 20 years, so the string would have deteriorated, probably fallen off completely by this point. In those days, there was no such thing as spring steel or carbon steel or whatever. So they used substances such as tortoise shell, and I mean literally the shell of a tortoise, or something like a horn of a big animal, like maybe an ox's horn or something like that. So they would get something that was in a crescent shape, and then you would have to bend that very stiff material and they would have drilled holes in it and tie string on both ends of the point. So imagine a crescent, and you've got to bring the two ends together, which means you're going to have to bend this really stiff material while you're tying the string, because the string has to be very taut in order to launch the arrow. So you're going to have to create that tension with your hands. That's really tough to do. So Penelope's not making this very easy for these guys. Telemachus now is going to show us how strong he is. He goes and he, at his mother's direction, buries 12 axes. So imagine the axe head side down. He buries them and he makes two channels, 6 and 6. And everybody is really impressed because they're very, very straight and they're all very even. So now we're getting some indications that Telemachus not only can talk a tough deal, but he actually has he has a good eye, which might be important to him in battle, and apparently a certain amount of physical strength. The swineherd and the cowherd now slip out into the courtyard, and Eumaeus is praying that Odysseus will come home. So he still didn't believe that the beggar was Odysseus. So now Odysseus really does reveal his identity. He says, "Really, really, it's me. And listen, I love this. I'll find you wives and give you property if you'll fight on my side." So notice what he promises. Property, okay, that makes sense. He's the king, he can give land. He's also going to give him some women. So again, once again showing us how Homer regards women basically as property. We cry, we look beautiful, and we get passed around as property. Odysseus then, he shows them the scar, and that's what convinces them. He now tells them to lock the palace, the courtyard, from all sides. If you were in class, I would ask you why he did that. So I guess I have to tell you, since you're not here. He's doing this because he doesn't want anyone to escape. Not so much because he's bloodthirsty, but if anyone were able to run away, they might go and get reinforcements. So he wants to deal with these guys, all of them, once and for all. So he's going to trap them inside the courtyard in order to make sure that he's dealt with the whole pack of them. Meanwhile, as I told you, the arrow is very stiff. I'm sorry, the bow is very stiff, and none of the suitors can bend the bow enough to get the string taut. So what they try to do is they heat it to try to make it more pliable, and even that doesn't work. So they say, never mind, it's a feast day. We'll have the contest tomorrow, and we'll sacrifice some animal thighs to the gods, and they'll help us. Mind you, it's Odysseus's animals that they're going to sacrifice, but never mind. So Odysseus comes in, and he's still in beggar disguise, and he says, "Hey, let me try. I'm not in the contest. I just want to do it just for fun." And the suitors are actually afraid. They're afraid that he's going to succeed. They've seen him fighting on the porch with that other beggar, and they say, "Listen, if you do succeed, we're going to ship you off to the mainland king who wrecks all men alive." So they basically threaten to kill him if he succeeds. Penelope comes in and she scolds them and says, "Wait a minute, he's a guest of Telemachus. How dare you? He's not trying to compete for my hand in marriage, so let him try." So interestingly, Penelope's showing a little more guts. She's up until now been the woman who sits around weeping, but now she's taking on the suitors. And you might ask yourself why. I think it's because Telemachus is starting to show some power towards the suitors, so his boldness has emboldened her. Before, she felt like she had to shield him, and the only way she could do that was by sacrificing herself. But now that he's showing maturity, she's kind of daring. And at this point, seriously, what does she have to lose? She's decided she's going to have this contest. She's not thrilled about marrying them, so what the heck? Why not insult them while she's at it? Telemachus steps in and says, "Listen, this is my bow. I inherited it from my father. It's mine to do with as I want. And I say that, oh, by the way, Mom, you go inside." Once again, "Mom, you go inside. I'll deal with this. I'll decide what's going to be done with this. You, Mom, go do your womanly thing." So again, this is the third time we've seen Telemachus treat his mom like, "Okay, I'm in charge. You're not. Go to your room." Just as Odysseus is about to take the bow, so now Telemachus has said, "Okay, beggar, you can do your thing." So just as he's about to do this, Odysseus leans over and whispers to the old nurse to have the women hunker down behind locked doors. So he does want to protect the women, even though some of them can't be trusted. The battle is about to begin. So he picks up the bow, and of course he's strong enough to string it. And Zeus cracks a thunderbolt to make it more interesting, and for the high drama. And Odysseus, of course, is able to shoot the arrow cleanly between the axes, and then he nods to his son to begin the battle. Notice that between them, they've managed to put a weapon in Odysseus's hands. No one else has one, but he's got his bow and arrow, and it is the feast day of Apollo the archer. How handy is that? So that concludes our makeup class session. I will see you all on Thursday. We will cover the remainder of the book, chapters 22, 23, and I gave you specific lines of 24. So we'll whip through that pretty quickly, and then we'll have time for our test. And of course, I will take any questions that you have. See you then. Bye-bye.